This story is titled, I Sold My Apartment to Save Our Family Hotel from Bankruptcy. But at the staff meeting, my parents announced my brother as CEO, so I made a call that left them stunned. Hi everyone! Before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy content like this, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and make sure you never miss out on amazing videos. Alright, let's get started. Hey everyone! I've been sitting on this for a while, but I feel like I just need to get it all out. So here goes. My 42 female family owns this small mountain hotel. It's been in the family since my grandparents built it back in the 70s. Growing up, I spent a lot of time there, helping out with little things like check-ins or organizing supplies. It's not some fancy chain hotel. It's more like a cozy lodge where people come for hiking trips or a quiet weekend away. Anyway, my parents took over after my grandparents retired. But let's just say, business wasn't their thing. Over time, the place got run down. Reviews tanked, bookings dropped, and they kept patching things up with duct tape and prayer. I guess they thought things would magically turn around, but they didn't. So a little over a year ago, my dad called me, sounding more upset than I've ever heard him. He said that the hotel was on the verge of going under. My parents had tried to pour everything into it, and losing it would have meant losing not just their livelihood, but a big part of our family history. I won't lie, I hesitated at first. I had a good life in Portland. I'd been working in hospitality for years, climbing my way up to a management position I was proud of. I had my own apartment, a circle of friends, and a routine that felt stable. But when your parents call you saying they're weeks away from losing everything, what are you supposed to do? So without hesitation, I sold my apartment, left my job, and packed everything into my car. I told myself it would just be temporary, a few months to help stabilize things, then back to my life. When I got home, the situation was even worse than I'd imagined. The hotel was barely functioning. The carpets were stained. The furniture looked like it had been picked up from a thrift store, and everything smelled faintly of mildew. Guests were complaining about broken AC units, noisy plumbing, and rude staff. I'd always known the place was dated, but I hadn't realized just how bad things had gotten. The financials were a mess too. My dad handed me a stack of invoices, receipts, and bank statements in a shoebox, as if I could just wave a magic wand and make it all make sense. There were overdue bills, unpaid vendors, and accounts that didn't even reconcile. It was overwhelming, to say the least. I didn't have time to dwell on how bad things were, though. I took full responsibility and just started working. The first thing I tackled was the reservation system, which was so outdated it could barely handle online bookings. I upgraded it to something modern, which was way more expensive than I wanted, but it was necessary. Then I moved on to the physical stuff, replacing the lobby furniture, repainting the walls, fixing leaky faucets, and replacing light fixtures. I didn't have a big budget, so I got creative, scouring clearance sales and bargaining with local suppliers. I spent hours every day with the staff, trying to retrain them and create some sense of professionalism. Most of them weren't even bad workers. They just hadn't been given proper guidance in years. I made checklists, set clear expectations, and started holding regular meetings to make sure everyone was on the same page. Some people quit when they realized I wasn't messing around, but the ones who stayed became my biggest supporters. Marketing was another nightmare. The hotel didn't even have a social media presence. I built everything from scratch. Instagram, Facebook, the works. I started posting photos of the renovations, promoting special offers, and sharing local attractions to draw people in. I reached out to bloggers and travel influencers, offering free stays in exchange for reviews. It was a slow process, but we started seeing more bookings almost immediately. Honestly, those first few months were a blur. I was working 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. I'd crash in one of the empty rooms at night, eating microwave dinners and staring at spreadsheets until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. My friends back in Portland would text me, asking how I was doing, and I'd give them the same answer every time. It's fine, just busy. I didn't want to admit how completely exhausted and overwhelmed I felt. But little by little, things started to turn around. Guests were noticing the changes, and we started getting better reviews online. The staff was more confident, more organized, and it showed. Even my parents seemed more optimistic, which felt like a small win after months of seeing them so stressed and defeated. About 8 months in, I finally felt like we were out of the danger zone. The hotel was turning a profit for the first time in years. I had spent countless hours fixing systems, improving the guest experience, and getting the place back on the map. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable, and that felt like a huge accomplishment. So, when my parents called a staff meeting, I walked into the room buzzing with anticipation. I'd spent the night before preparing a presentation, complete with colorful charts and before and after photos of all the improvements we'd made. I even practiced a few lines to thank the team for their hard work. I imagined applause, smiles, maybe even a toast to our success. Instead, my dad stood up and cleared his throat in that awkward, deliberate way he always did before saying something he knew wouldn't go over well. My heart sank a little, but I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe they just wanted to talk about next steps. Then he said it. We're excited to announce that Tyler will be stepping into the role of CEO to guide the hotel into its next chapter. I froze, the corners of my carefully crafted presentation folder digging into my palm. Tyler? CEO? I must have misheard. Let me paint you a picture of my brother, Tyler. He's 3 years younger than me, but might as well be decades behind in maturity. While I was studying hospitality in college, staying up late to nail group projects and pulling double shifts at the campus hotel, Tyler was dabbling in everything and committing to nothing. One month he was obsessed with photography, snapping moody shots of street lamps and empty parking lots. The next, he was designing t-shirts for a clothing line that never left the sketchbook stage. It wasn't ambition, more like daydreaming with a sprinkle of delusion. He'd wander into the hotel once in a blue moon, toss out a vague suggestion like, "You know what this place needs? A juice bar," and then vanish again, off to his next fleeting obsession. And now, this guy, the same one who didn't even know how to log into the reservation system, was going to be the CEO of the hotel I'd poured my blood, sweat, and savings into saving. My ears rang as the weight of my dad's words settled in, drowning out the murmurs of surprise from the staff around me. My perfectly crafted presentation suddenly felt like a cruel joke. I just sat there in shock. My parents didn't even try to justify their decision beyond saying, "Tyler has the skill of leadership by nature. He was born with it." That's what my mom said. Different. Like somehow his complete lack of experience was a strength. Tyler walked in late to the meeting, of course, with that smug grin he always has, and said, "Don't worry, Casey. You're great at the operational stuff. I'll focus on the big picture." I don't think I've ever felt so dismissed in my life. I wanted to argue, to remind them that I'd given up my life in Portland to save this place, but I didn't. I just smiled and nodded while the staff clapped awkwardly. That night, I stayed late in the office, staring at the books and wondering why I even bothered. I'd worked so hard to get the hotel back on its feet, and it felt like none of it mattered. My parents had already decided who was more important. I didn't know it at the time, but that meeting was the beginning of something bigger, something I never could have predicted. Looking back now, I can see how much it shaped what came next. But at that moment, all I could feel was this overwhelming sense of frustration and betrayal. It was like everything I'd worked for had just been handed to someone who didn't deserve it. The days after that staff meeting were a blur. I went through the motions because, well, what else was I supposed to do? But I can't lie. It felt different, like the air in the place had changed. My parents were still acting like nothing was wrong. Tyler was strutting around like he owned the place, which I guess he technically did now, and the staff was starting to pick up on the weird vibe. I kept telling myself I just needed time to adjust. Maybe Tyler really did have some kind of big picture vision that I wasn't seeing yet. I mean, he had to, right? Why else would my parents put him in charge? But it didn't take long for me to realize that wasn't the case. Tyler's version of leadership turned out to be, well, not leading at all. On his first day, he walked into the office mid-morning wearing sunglasses, holding a smoothie, and said, "Okay, so, first order of business. What's our long-term plan for innovation?" I stared at him for a second, waiting for him to laugh or give me some kind of clue that he was joking. He didn't. Tyler, we just finished updating all the major systems," I said. "The next step is focusing on maintaining those changes and building consistency with the staff." He nodded like he was really deep in thought, then said, Cool. But what about, branding? Should we be targeting a younger crowd? I think I read somewhere that Gen Z is all about experiences. I don't know why that moment stuck with me so much, but it felt like the perfect snapshot of Tyler's approach. Lots of vague buzzwords, no real direction, and absolutely no understanding of how the day-to-day operations actually worked. It got worse from there. His first big change was cutting the complimentary breakfast, which had been one of our highest-rated features. Guests loved it. Fresh fruit, pastries, coffee, all that. Tyler decided it was too expensive and replaced it with a self-serve coffee station and a basket of granola bars. I tried to explain how much this would affect guest satisfaction, but he just waved me off and said, "It's not about what people want, it's about what they need." Within a week, we started getting complaints. Guests who had been coming for years were leaving angry reviews, saying the hotel was cutting corners and losing its charm. One woman even said, "I come here every winter because it feels like home. Now it feels like a cheap motel." That one hurt. Tyler didn't care, though. He was too busy making bold moves, like firing Patricia, the head of housekeeping, because she wouldn't agree to his new scheduling system. Patricia had been with us for 15 years. She knew every inch of that hotel and trained almost all the housekeepers. Losing her was a huge blow, and the team felt it. When I tried to step in and explain how much we relied on her, "Do you even understand what you've done?" I snapped. "Patricia is the reason we've been getting 5-star cleanliness reviews. She keeps this place running." Tyler brushed me off. "We need people who are flexible, Casey." She wasn't a team player. When I pointed out the guest backlash from cutting the complimentary breakfast, my mom came to Tyler's defense. "He's trying new things," she said. Her voice clipped like I was being unreasonable. "You can't expect everything to work right away. Give him time." Meanwhile, I'd been the one dealing with angry emails and reviews all week. But apparently Tyler's vision was more important than actual results. I wanted to scream, "I sold my apartment to save this place and you're letting him destroy it." But I knew it would fall on deaf ears. They couldn't see past their blind faith in Tyler. But here's the thing. Tyler wasn't the one dealing with the fallout. I was. I was the one fielding complaints from guests when their rooms weren't ready on time because we were short-staffed. I was the one trying to calm down the other housekeepers who felt overworked and undervalued. Tyler? He was too busy brainstorming innovative marketing strategies to actually deal with the mess he created. And my parents? They were no help. Every time I tried to talk to them about what was going on, they just told me to give Tyler some space to figure things out. "He's new to this," my mom kept saying. Like that was a good excuse for him running the place into the ground. It all came to a head about a month after Tyler took over. I walked into the office one morning and found him sitting at my desk, eating a bagel and scrolling through his phone. "Hey, Casey," he said, without even looking up. "Quick question. Do we really need a full maintenance team? I feel like most of this stuff could be outsourced." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The maintenance team was already stretched thin, and outsourcing would have been way more expensive in the long run. I tried to explain this to him, showing him the numbers, but he just shrugged and said, "Sometimes you gotta spend money to save money." That was the moment I realized I couldn't do this anymore. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I tried to fix things, it didn't matter. Tyler was in charge now, and my parents had made it clear they weren't going to step in. I was fighting a losing battle, but even though I'd mentally checked out, I couldn't just leave. The hotel was still my family's legacy, even if it felt like they didn't care about it as much as I did. I kept showing up every day, doing what I could to keep things from completely falling apart. And then one day, everything changed. I was driving back from a supplier meeting when I passed an old rundown building on the edge of town. It used to be a competitor of ours, back when it was still open. Now it was just sitting there, empty, with a faded "for sale" sign out front. I don't know what made me stop, but I pulled into the parking lot and just sat there, staring at it. The building was in rough shape, but it had potential. It was in a better location than our hotel, closer to the main road, and with stunning views of the valley. It was bigger too, with plenty of space for upgrades. I started thinking about all the things I'd wanted to do at the family hotel, but couldn't because Tyler or my parents wouldn't let me. Eco-friendly amenities, modernized rooms, a proper spa. The list went on. Looking at that old building, I realized I didn't have to keep fighting for something that wasn't mine. I could start fresh. I sat in that parking lot for over an hour, running through the numbers in my head. It would be risky, for sure. I'd already drained most of my savings, and buying the building would mean taking on a massive amount of debt. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the right move. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with possibility, plans, and a million what-ifs. By the time the sun came up, I'd made my decision. I called the realtor as soon as their office opened and scheduled a viewing for later that week. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, I felt like I had control again. This wasn't about proving anything to my parents or trying to fix Tyler's mistakes. It was about building something for myself, something I could be proud of. As I'm writing this now, I think that moment in the parking lot was the first time I'd felt genuinely hopeful in a long time. I didn't know how hard the road ahead would be, but for the first time, I was excited to see where it would take me. The viewing later that week felt surreal. Walking through the old building, I could see all the problems it had: peeling paint, broken fixtures, worn carpets, but I could also see what it could become. The bones of the place were solid, and the layout had so much potential. Large windows with views of the valley, spacious rooms, and even a spot that could be turned into a proper spa. My mind was buzzing with ideas. The realtor was one of those overly cheery types, talking about how the place just needed a little TLC. I smiled and nodded, not bothering to correct her. I knew it was going to take more than a coat of paint to bring this place back to life, but for the first time in months, I didn't feel overwhelmed by the challenge. I felt motivated. By the end of the tour, I had already decided. I didn't even haggle. I just told the realtor I'd take it. She looked surprised, probably because most people would have walked away after seeing the state of the place. But she recovered quickly and said she'd start the paperwork. I called the bank that same day to start the loan process. It wasn't easy convincing them to give me the money, but I pulled every bit of experience I had, every connection, and managed to secure the financing. When the deal closed a few weeks later, I stood in the empty lobby of my new project, looking around at the cracked tiles and faded wallpaper. It was mine, completely mine. I didn't have to ask anyone for permission to make changes, didn't have to justify my decisions to anyone. That thought alone was worth all the sleepless nights I knew were ahead. The next few months were a whirlwind. I threw myself into the renovations, working side by side with contractors to make sure everything was done right. I learned more about plumbing and electrical work than I ever thought I'd need to know. I spent hours poring over catalogs, picking out furniture, fixtures, and decor that fit the vision I had for the space. Every single detail mattered to me, from the paint colors to the way the light would hit the lobby in the morning. I also started building a team. Some of the staff from my family's hotel had been fed up with Tyler's management and jumped ship as soon as they heard I was opening a new place. Sarah, who'd been working the front desk for years, was one of the first to join. "I don't know what you're planning," she said, "but I know it'll be better than what we've got now." Patricia, the head of housekeeping Tyler had fired, also came on board. She cried when I offered her the position, saying she thought she'd never find work in the industry again after what had happened. Word got around town quickly. People were curious, some supportive, others less so. I overheard someone at the grocery store calling me spiteful for opening a competitor to my family's hotel. I ignored it. This wasn't about them. This wasn't even about my parents or Tyler anymore. This was about me finally doing something for myself. When it came to marketing, I went all in. I hired a local photographer to take professional shots of the renovations as they progressed and started posting them on social media. I reached out to travel influencers and bloggers, offering them free stays once we opened. I even worked with a branding agency to come up with a name that reflected the feel of the place. We settled on Elevate. It felt fitting, aspirational, unique, and tied to the mountain views that made the location so special. But let me tell you, the stress of pulling all of this together was unreal. There were nights when I'd sit in my car outside the building, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. The loan payments loomed over me like a dark cloud, and every unexpected cost, because there were a lot of those, made me anxious. I was burning through my savings at a terrifying rate, and the pressure to get everything perfect was suffocating. But every time I thought about giving up, I reminded myself of why I started this in the first place. The turning point came about 4 months into the renovations. The first room was finally finished, completely redone from top to bottom. It wasn't just functional, it was beautiful. I stood in the doorway for what felt like hours, just taking it in. For the first time, it felt real. Like maybe I could actually pull this off. I couldn't help but wonder what my parents would think about all of this. I didn't tell them much about the project, not because I was trying to keep it a secret, but because I didn't want their opinions coloring my decisions. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of them walking through the doors, seeing how different it was from the hotel they'd built. Would they be proud? Angry? Disappointed? Part of me didn't care anymore, but another part, one I wasn't ready to admit out loud, still wanted their approval, even after everything. By the time opening day rolled around, I was running on pure adrenaline. The place wasn't perfect. There were still things I wanted to tweak, but it was ready. We had a soft launch, inviting friends, family, and a few local business owners to check it out. Seeing their reactions was everything I'd hoped for. People kept saying things like, "I can't believe this is the same building," and "This feels like something you'd see in a big city, not here." The first real guests checked in a week later. A couple celebrating their anniversary, followed by a family on a road trip. Watching them explore the space, seeing their smiles as they admired the rooms and amenities, it made every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, worth it. My parents showed up during the soft launch, walking into the lobby unannounced. I hadn't invited them, not because I wanted to keep them out, but because I wasn't ready for whatever reaction they'd bring. When I saw them standing by the front desk, I froze for a second, watching their faces as they took it all in. My dad's expression was stiff, his eyes darting around the space like he couldn't decide what to focus on. My mom stood next to him, her arms crossed tightly, her mouth pressed into a thin line. They didn't say much, but the look on my mom's face said everything. This wasn't pride, this was sadness, maybe even disappointment. They lingered for a while, walking slowly through the lobby and peeking into the room. At one point, my dad stopped and ran his hand along the edge of the new front desk. "It's different," he finally said, his voice low and strained. My mom didn't say a word. I could feel the weight of what they weren't saying, that I'd built this on my own, without their blessing, and that it was better than what they'd been holding on to. When they finally left, they didn't say goodbye. They just walked out, leaving me standing there, wondering if I'd lost something I didn't even know I was still holding on to. But the best part? I didn't feel like I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for someone to criticize me, or tell me I was doing it wrong. I was finally free to build something I could be proud of, and that feeling was priceless. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were hiccups, plumbing issues in one of the guest rooms, a mix-up with a reservation system that left me scrambling to find a room for a couple who'd booked months in advance. But those challenges felt different. They were mine to solve, and for the first time, I felt like I had the confidence to handle them. Elevate wasn't just a building. It was proof that I didn't need anyone else's approval to succeed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The weeks after my hotel opened were a blur. Guests were rolling in, reviews were pouring in, and the hard work was paying off. Walking through the lobby every morning, I felt this weird mix of pride and disbelief, like I couldn't quite wrap my head around the fact that this was something I had built from scratch. But as I settled into my new normal, the contrast between my hotel and my parents became harder to ignore. Their hotel was struggling, and not just in the ways it had been before. I started hearing whispers from vendors about late payments. One of the cleaning suppliers I'd worked with for years mentioned they'd stopped delivering to the family hotel because they hadn't been paid in months. A local tour operator said the same thing. Apparently, they'd been stiffed on a booking commission Tyler had promised them. At first, I tried to ignore it. It wasn't my problem anymore. I had my own hotel to run, and I couldn't afford to get sucked back into the drama. But the signs kept piling up, and it became impossible not to notice. It wasn't just the business side of things either. Guests who had been loyal to my parents' hotel for years were starting to drift my way. One couple told me they'd tried to book a weekend there but were put off by the recent reviews, which mentioned unclean rooms, understaffed service, and even a broken heating system that hadn't been fixed for weeks. "We always stayed there when we came to town," the woman said as I checked them in. "But something's changed. It doesn't feel the same anymore." I didn't say anything, just smiled and handed them their room key. But inside, I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly things had fallen apart. What really got to me, though, was the look on my parents' faces whenever I saw them. They stopped by the soft launch, of course, but after that, they kept their distance. When we did run into each other, usually at the grocery store or some community event, they looked exhausted. My dad's shoulders seemed permanently hunched, and my mom had this tight-lipped expression that didn't leave much room for conversation. Then, one day, they showed up at Elevate. It was late afternoon, just after check-in rush. My parents came into the lobby, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen them. My mom clutched her purse like it was a lifeline, and my dad kept glancing around, like he didn't want to make eye contact with anyone. "Casey, can we talk?" my dad asked, his voice quieter than usual. I led them to one of the seating areas near the fireplace. They sat down, but neither of them seemed to know where to start. Finally, my mom blurted out, "We need your help." I wasn't surprised. I'd seen it coming for weeks, ever since the vendors started complaining and the reviews took a nosedive. But hearing them say it out loud still felt strange. For months, they'd brushed off my concerns, ignored my advice, and handed the reins to Tyler. And now, here they were, asking me to clean up his mess. "I don't know what you expect me to do," I said carefully. "You have a CEO. Maybe you should ask him for help." My dad flinched at that like I'd hit a nerve. "Tyler's trying his best," he said, though it didn't sound convincing. "Is he?" I shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like it." "Casey, please," my mom said, her voice cracking. "You're the only one who knows how to fix this." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "I tried to help before, remember? You didn't want my help then. You wanted Tyler." My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "We made a mistake, okay? But we can't go back and undo it. We need you now." I looked at them. These two people who had spent their whole lives building something, only to watch it fall apart. And as much as I wanted to feel vindicated, all I felt was tired. "I can't," I said finally. "I'm sorry, but I have my own business to run now. If you want my advice, here it is. Get professional help. Hire someone who can actually clean up the mess Tyler's made." They didn't say anything after that. My mom looked like she might cry, and my dad just sat there, staring at the floor. After a while, they got up and left without another word. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. My mind kept going back to that conversation, replaying every word, every expression. I knew I'd done the right thing. Setting boundaries was something I'd struggled with for years, and this was a chance to stand my ground. But it didn't make it any easier. What bothered me more, though, was the nagging feeling that something wasn't adding up. The late payments, the canceled vendor contracts, the broken heating system. It was all too much to just be bad management. Even Tyler couldn't screw things up this bad on his own. I started paying closer attention to what people were saying about the family hotel. Vendors mentioned orders being delayed because of budget issues, but no one could tell me exactly what those issues were. Former staff hinted that Tyler had been making weird changes to the payroll system, but no one could explain what that meant. The final straw came when a guest, who had stayed at both hotels, casually mentioned a rumor they'd heard about Tyler. People are saying he's spending all his time in Denver, they said. What's he even doing down there? I didn't have an answer, but the question stuck with me. Tyler hadn't been around much, and the few times he had, he looked distracted. He wasn't the type to sit behind a desk crunching numbers. So where was the money going? At that point, we were doing well. Better than I'd hoped, honestly, but I couldn't shake the unease I felt. My parents' hotel wasn't just struggling, it was sinking, fast, and I had a feeling that Tyler wasn't just steering the ship poorly. He was actively drilling holes in it. I didn't know what I was going to do with that feeling, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The uneasy feeling sat with me, growing stronger every time I thought about the family hotel and how fast things were unraveling there. Tyler wasn't just incompetent. There was definitely something else going on. So I started digging. I went through old emails, invoices, and anything else I could get my hands on that might offer a clue. Tyler had been careless. He hadn't changed much since I left the family hotel, and I still had access to some of the systems. At first, it was just small things. Odd payments listed under vague descriptions like consulting or vendor management. None of the names matched up with anything I recognized, and a quick search online turned up nothing. Then there were the inflated invoices, regular services like landscaping or repairs, suddenly costing 3 or 4 times what they should. It didn't take long to figure out that these weren't just mistakes. Someone was bleeding the hotel dry, and Tyler was the one signing off on everything. I couldn't take it anymore. I drove over to my parents' house, the printouts clutched in my hand. It was late, but I didn't care. The anger had been simmering for weeks, and now it was boiling over. They needed to know what was happening. My mom answered the door, looking surprised to see me. "Casey, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to both of you," I said, pushing past her into the house. Now, my dad was in the living room, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he flipped through the newspaper. He looked up, confused. "What's going on?" I dropped the stack of papers onto the coffee table in front of him. "That's what's going on?" My voice cracked. "I sold my apartment to save you from this. I gave up my entire life to keep this hotel afloat, and you handed it all over to Tyler without a second thought." He frowned, picking up the first page. My mom sat down next to him, glancing at the printouts, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "What is this?" my dad asked, like he didn't really want to know the answer. "It's proof that Tyler's been funneling money out of the business," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "These payments? They're fake. These companies don't exist. And the inflated invoices? That money's not going to vendors. It's going somewhere else, probably straight into Tyler's pocket." My mom looked pale. "That can't be right. Tyler wouldn't what?" I interrupted. "Wouldn't lie? Wouldn't steal? Open your eyes, Mom. This is why the hotel is falling apart. He's not just bad at running it. He's actively draining it." My dad set the papers down, rubbing his temple. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, like the weight of everything was finally crushing him. "How did you find this?" he asked quietly. "I still have access to some of the systems," I admitted. "I've been keeping an eye on things because, well, let's be honest, I didn't trust him. And I was right not to." My mom was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "He's our son, Casey. He wouldn't do this. There has to be some other explanation." "Then ask him," I said, crossing my arms. "Call him right now and ask him where the money's going. But don't expect an answer, because he's been dodging that question for months." My dad didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the printouts, his face a mask of defeat. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" my mom finally asked. "Because it's not my problem anymore," I said. "I warned you about putting him in charge. I told you he wasn't ready, that he didn't know what he was doing. But you didn't listen. You wanted to believe he could handle it. And now this is where it's gotten you." My dad looked up at me then, his eyes red-rimmed. "What do we do, Casey? How do we fix this?" I almost laughed at the irony. After months of ignoring my advice, now they wanted my help? But the anger fizzled as quickly as it came, replaced by something softer, something I didn't want to name. "You need to confront him," I said, sitting down across from them. "Show him this. Demand answers. And then you need to bring in someone who actually knows how to fix the mess he's made. A professional consultant, not me. You're the only one who understands this business," my mom said, her voice pleading. "We trust you." "Now you trust me?" I said, shaking my head. "That's rich. Look, I'll give you advice if you need it. But I'm not coming back to fix this. You need to figure out how to clean up your own mess." They didn't argue after that. My dad nodded silently, and my mom wiped her eyes with a tissue, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the image of them sitting there, broken and defeated. Part of me felt guilty for not doing more to help, but another part, the part that had spent months being dismissed and overlooked, knew I'd done the right thing. I drove back to my hotel, knowing this wasn't the end. Tyler would have to answer for what he'd done, one way or another. And when that confrontation came, I wanted to be there to see it. Not for revenge, but for closure. Because no matter how far I'd come, the past still had its hold on me, and I wasn't ready to let it go just yet. And the weeks after my confrontation with my parents were eerily quiet. They didn't call, and I didn't check in. I told myself it was for the best. I had my hotel to focus on, and the family hotel wasn't my responsibility anymore. But the whispers around town didn't stop, and the contrast between the two hotels became impossible to ignore. While my hotel thrived with steady bookings and glowing reviews, my parents' hotel continued to sink. It was like watching a ship slowly take on water, and Tyler was nowhere to be found. Then, one morning, Sarah came into my office holding her phone with a grim look. "You need to see this," she said. The headline was blunt: "Local Hotel Under Investigation for Financial Misconduct." The article didn't name Tyler outright, but it didn't need to. The details lined up too perfectly: unpaid invoices, suspicious payments, and accusations of fraud tied to unlicensed financial dealings. My stomach dropped. The whispers I'd been ignoring suddenly felt louder. Where was Tyler getting the money? Why were payments to vendors so inconsistent? I didn't have to dig much further before the pieces started falling into place. A vendor confirmed that invoices had been inflated or outright fabricated, and I heard through a friend in Denver that Tyler's accounts were flagged for large, unaccounted-for transfers, casinos, failed business investments, even offshore accounts. It was all there. The hammer finally dropped when investigators showed up at the family hotel. A guest tipped me off that government cars had been parked outside all day. I didn't need to go there to know what was happening. Tyler's mess was unraveling, and everyone in town was talking about it. That evening, my parents finally called. My mom's voice cracked as she said, "Casey, we don't know what to do. They've frozen the accounts. They're asking questions we don't have answers for." I kept my tone steady, even though I could feel their desperation through the phone. "I told you months ago to get help. This is what happens when you ignore the signs. We just wanted to protect him," my dad said, his voice heavy with regret. "He's our son, and look where that got you," I replied. I didn't say it to be cruel, but because it was the truth. After I hung up, I felt the weight of it all settle over me. The decisions, the sacrifices, the consequences. Everything had led to this moment. My parents were facing the reality of their choices, Tyler was finally being held accountable, and the family business that once felt so unshakable was crumbling under the weight of it all. But for the first time, I wasn't carrying that burden anymore. My hotel was thriving, not because of luck or anyone's help, but because I had fought for it. Every piece, every detail, every decision was mine. And as much as it hurt to watch my family's legacy fall apart, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of peace. I had built something that couldn't be taken away from me, and no matter what came next, I knew I'd be ready for it. Thank you guys for reading.